It was an ordinary Friday night in the ER. Well, as ordinary as a night can be in one of the busiest hospitals in the city. I'd been working as a nurse for over a decade, and while I'd seen my fair share of chaos, nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I was in the middle of checking on a patient when the automatic doors slid open, and in walked a 12-year-old girl clutching a baby in her arms. She looked so out of place, standing there in oversized sneakers and a hoodie that swallowed her tiny frame. The baby, no more than a few months old, was wrapped in a faded pink blanket. At first, I thought she might be here with a parent or older sibling, but there was no one else with her. She walked straight up to the front desk, her arms cradling the baby tightly, and spoke to the receptionist. I couldn't hear what she said, but the look on the receptionist's face told me something was off. I stepped closer, curious, as the receptionist waved me over. "She's asking for help," the receptionist whispered. "She says the baby is sick." The girl was led into one of the exam rooms, and I followed, my professional instincts kicking in. As she sat down on the edge of the hospital bed, I took a moment to assess her. She was pale, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were puffy, like she'd been crying. The baby in her arms squirmed weakly, its tiny fists clenching and unclenching. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "The baby has been crying all day," she said quietly. "I think something's wrong." I nodded, moving to check the baby's vitals. Its skin was flushed, and its breathing was shallow. Fever, I thought. Possibly dehydration. But something about the situation didn't add up. "Where are your parents?" I asked, glancing back at the girl. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the blanket. "They're not here," she said after a moment. That was the first red flag. As the doctors worked on stabilizing the baby, I stayed with the girl, trying to piece together her story. She told us her name was Emily, and that she'd brought the baby in because she didn't know what else to do. But when we asked her whose baby it was, she froze. "It's mine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The room went silent. At first, I thought I'd misheard her. A 12-year-old claiming to be the mother of an infant? It was almost impossible to wrap my head around. But the way she held the baby, the way she looked at it with a mixture of fear and love, it didn't seem like a lie. The doctors called CPS immediately, and within the hour, 2 social workers arrived to talk to Emily. As they led her into a private room, I couldn't help but wonder how she'd ended up in this situation. She was just a child herself. Yet here she was, claiming to be the mother of a baby who couldn't have been more than 3 months old. When the social workers came out of the room, their faces were grim. One of them pulled me aside and told me what Emily had said. The baby wasn't hers. It belonged to her 17-year-old sister, Abigail. Abigail had given birth in secret and had been hiding the baby at home, terrified of what their strict, deeply religious parents would do if they found out. Emily had been the one taking care of the baby while Abigail went to school, feeding it with formula she bought using spare change she'd saved up. But when the baby developed a fever and wouldn't stop crying, Emily panicked. She knew she couldn't take it to their parents, so she brought it here instead, hoping we could help. The revelation left me reeling. I'd seen plenty of complicated family situations in my career, but this was different. A 12-year-old girl taking on the responsibility of caring for an infant? The weight of that kind of burden was unimaginable. The social workers contacted Abigail, who arrived at the hospital later that night. She looked as terrified as Emily had when she first walked in, clutching her backpack and avoiding eye contact with everyone. When she saw the baby, she burst into tears. From what I overheard, Abigail had kept her pregnancy hidden for the entire 9 months, wearing baggy clothes and skipping gym class to avoid suspicion. When she gave birth at home, Emily was the only one who knew. By the end of the night, CPS had taken custody of the baby, and Abigail and Emily were placed in emergency care. The parents were contacted, but judging by the social workers' expressions, that conversation didn't go well. As I clocked out of my shift and walked to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. She was just a kid, yet she'd been forced into an impossible situation, acting as both a sister and a mother. I'd seen a lot of heartbreaking cases over the years, but this one stuck with me. Not because of the tragedy of it all, but because of the quiet bravery it took for Emily to walk into that hospital and ask for help. Sometimes courage comes from the most unexpected places. After the chaos of that night, I couldn't get Emily and Abigail out of my head. Cases like theirs stick with you, no matter how many years you've spent in the field. The image of that 12-year-old walking into the ER with a baby in her arms, desperate but determined, replayed in my mind over and over. I kept wondering how things had gotten so bad that a child had to take on that kind of responsibility. The day after their visit, I asked around to see if anyone had heard updates from CPS or the hospital administration. It turned out both girls were staying in a temporary foster placement, while CPS tried to figure out the next steps. The baby, still running a low fever, was being kept in pediatric care for observation. Abigail and Emily weren't allowed to visit yet, but the hospital staff promised to keep them updated on the baby's condition. It wasn't much, but it was something. A week later, I was in the break room when I overheard one of the pediatric nurses talking about Emily and Abigail. "The parents showed up," she said, her voice low but laced with frustration. I froze, pretending to scroll through my phone as I listened in. "They came in yesterday," she continued. They were furious, blaming everyone, CPS, the hospital staff, even the baby, for ruining their family's reputation. My stomach turned. I'd heard stories about families like this before. Strict, deeply religious households, where appearances mattered more than anything else. But hearing it confirmed made my blood boil. "What about the girls?" another nurse asked. "They refused to talk to them," the first nurse said. CPS had to intervene to keep things from escalating. It was a mess. I didn't ask for more details, but that conversation stayed with me. If the parents couldn't even acknowledge the baby as part of their family, what chance did Abigail or Emily have of going home? Over the next few days, I kept tabs on the situation as best I could. The baby's fever finally broke, and she was moved out of critical care. Abigail and Emily were allowed supervised visits, though only separately. When I saw Emily sitting in the pediatric ward during one of her visits, she looked like a different person from the scared girl who had walked into the ER. She sat quietly beside the crib, her hands resting on her lap as she watched the baby sleep. "She's been so calm through all of this," one of the nurses whispered to me. "More mature than half the adults I've dealt with." I nodded, watching Emily reach out to gently adjust the baby's blanket. It was heartbreaking and inspiring all at once. This kid, barely old enough to navigate her own life, had been holding her sister's world together. Abigail's visit, on the other hand, was a different story. When she arrived, she couldn't stop crying. She hovered near the crib, her hands trembling as she tried to touch the baby without waking her. "It's my fault," I heard her say to the social worker. "I ruined everything." The social worker tried to comfort her, but Abigail was inconsolable. She blamed herself for putting Emily in an impossible position, for hiding the pregnancy, for the baby's health scare. Everything. "She's not eating," one of the nurses told me later. "Barely sleeping either. She's carrying so much guilt." It was clear that Abigail loved her baby, but it was just as clear that she was overwhelmed by the weight of her choices. The parents remained a looming presence in the background, their involvement minimal, but disruptive whenever it happened. CPS eventually scheduled a family mediation session, hoping to create a plan for Abigail and Emily's future. But from what I heard, it didn't go well. The parents refused to take responsibility for what had happened. They insisted that Abigail had brought shame on the family, and that Emily had disobeyed their authority by taking the baby to the hospital. "She didn't ask for permission," the father reportedly said during the session. "Permission," the CPS worker had shot back. "She saved the baby's life." Still, the parents refused to budge. They wanted nothing to do with the baby, and seemed more interested in punishing Abigail and Emily than in helping them. Despite the lack of support from their parents, there were glimmers of hope. Abigail began working with a counselor provided by CPS, slowly opening up about what had happened. She admitted that she'd been terrified throughout her pregnancy, hiding it from everyone but Emily out of fear of being disowned. "I didn't want to be a burden," she said during one of her sessions. "I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't." Emily, too, started receiving support. Her caseworker made sure she had someone to talk to, someone who could help her process everything she'd been through. She's still so protective of her sister, the caseworker told me one day. She doesn't blame Abigail for anything. She just wants to make sure the baby is okay. By the second week, a new possibility began to emerge. The girls had an aunt who lived in another state, someone who had been estranged from the family for years. When CPS contacted her, she was shocked to learn what had happened but immediately expressed interest in taking custody of all 3 children, Abigail, Emily, and the baby. She said she always knew her brother was too strict, one of the social workers told me. She's already filing paperwork to bring the girls to live with her. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing ever is in these situations. But it was a chance. A chance for the girls to get out of a toxic environment and start over with someone who seemed to genuinely care about them. The last time I saw Emily, she was sitting by the baby's crib, holding her tiny hand. Abigail sat beside her, still quiet, but looking a little stronger than before. The social worker came to escort them out of the hospital, explaining that the aunt had flown in and was waiting to meet them. As they left, Emily glanced back at me and gave a small wave. I waved back, hoping that wherever they were going, it was a place where they could finally feel safe. Sometimes the best you can do in this line of work is to help people get to the next chapter of their lives. For Emily, Abigail, and that baby, I hoped this chapter would be a better one. It didn't take long for the Aunt Rachel to arrive. When CPS informed her of the situation, she dropped everything, boarded the first flight, and showed up at the hospital with nothing but a carry-on bag and a determination that immediately set her apart. Rachel was different from the rest of the family. You could tell just by looking at her. Where Abigail and Emily's parents were rigid, cold, and obsessed with appearances, Rachel had an openness about her, a warmth that made it clear she wasn't here to judge. She barely knew the girls. Years of estrangement had kept her from being involved in their lives. But she was already acting like someone who cared deeply about their future. I first saw her when she walked into the pediatric ward to meet the baby. She was tall, with curly hair pulled back into a loose bun, and a faint accent that hinted at her years spent living in another state. The moment she stepped into the room, her eyes softened, and she smiled. The baby was still hooked up to monitors, but looked much better than she had the night Emily had brought her in. Rachel approached the crib slowly, as if she didn't want to disturb her, and leaned down to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. "She's beautiful," she said quietly. After her visit with the baby, Rachel met with CPS to discuss the logistics of taking custody. From what I overheard, she was a former teacher turned small business owner, with a stable income and plenty of room in her home to accommodate the girls and the baby. "I'll do whatever it takes," she told the caseworker. They deserve better than this. Her conviction was clear, but it wasn't going to be easy. The parents, predictably, were less than thrilled about the idea of Rachel stepping in. They saw her as an outsider, someone who had abandoned the family years ago when she moved away and broke ties with their rigid, religious lifestyle. "There are children," the father said during one of the mediation sessions. "We'll decide what's best for them." But Rachel didn't back down. "You've already decided, haven't you?" she said. "You've made it clear you want nothing to do with the baby. And you're punishing Abigail and Emily for stepping up when you wouldn't. They need stability, not more control." Her words hit a nerve. The father left the session early, slamming the door behind him. Meanwhile, Abigail and Emily were adjusting to the idea of living with Rachel. At first, they were hesitant. Rachel was practically a stranger to them, someone they'd only ever heard about in passing. But as they spent more time with her, their walls began to come down. Rachel visited them at their temporary foster placement almost every day, bringing little things to make them feel more comfortable. A box of Abigail's favorite chocolates, a journal for Emily, and a stuffed animal for the baby. She asked questions about their lives, listened to their stories, and reassured them that she wasn't here to take over but to help. Abigail, who had been so withdrawn in the beginning, started to open up during one of these visits. She told Rachel about the months she'd spent hiding her pregnancy, how terrified she'd been, and how much she relied on Emily to help her get through it. "I never wanted to drag her into this," she said, her voice cracking. But I didn't have anyone else. Rachel reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. You're not dragging anyone into anything, she said. You did the best you could with what you had. And now, you don't have to do it alone anymore. Emily, on the other hand, was harder to read. She was polite but guarded, her focus always on the baby. During their supervised visits at the hospital, she stayed by the crib, watching every move the nurses made and asking endless questions about the baby's health. She's like a little mother hen, one of the nurses said to me after one of Emily's visits. It's heartbreaking and amazing at the same time. She's so young, but she takes everything so seriously. Rachel noticed it too. One afternoon, after Emily had spent hours hovering by the crib, Rachel pulled her aside. You don't have to carry this all on your own, you know, she said gently. Emily looked up at her, her expression unreadable. She needs me, she said simply. And she'll have you, Rachel said. But she'll have me too. And Abigail. You don't have to do this by yourself anymore. For the first time, Emily's tough exterior cracked. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, and let Rachel pull her into a hug. The legal process of transferring custody to Rachel took time, but things moved faster than expected thanks to the parents' lack of cooperation. They made it clear they wanted nothing to do with the baby, and had no interest in Abigail or Emily if it meant dealing with Rachel. We won't fight it, the mother said during the final mediation session. But don't expect us to be involved in their lives after this. Rachel didn't respond. She simply nodded and signed the paperwork, her focus on the girls' future rather than their parents' bitterness. The day Rachel was granted full custody, I saw the girls at the hospital for what I knew would be the last time. Abigail looked nervous but relieved, her hands fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. Emily was quieter than usual, her attention fixed on the baby, as she gently rocked her in her arms. Rachel arrived with a car seat and a diaper bag, ready to take the baby home. The nurses helped her secure the baby in the car seat, and for a moment, Emily hesitated, as if she wasn't ready to let go. You'll still be with her, Rachel reminded her softly. Every step of the way. Emily nodded, her grip on the baby loosening slightly. As they left the hospital, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The girls were heading into an uncertain future, but for the first time, it felt like they had a real chance. Rachel wasn't perfect, but she was exactly what they needed. Someone who saw them not as burdens or mistakes, but as kids who deserved love and stability. I watched them walk out the doors, Rachel carrying the diaper bag, and Abigail holding the car seat, while Emily hovered protectively beside her. In this line of work, you don't always get to see happy endings. But that day, as I watched them drive away together, I felt hopeful. They had been through hell, but now they had a chance to start over. And that was more than enough. Rachel's house was a world away from the strict, oppressive environment Emily and Abigail had grown up in. Located in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, it wasn't as large or polished as their parents' home, but it was warm, inviting, and full of life. Pictures of Rachel's travels hung on the walls, shelves were crammed with books and knickknacks, and the scent of fresh coffee or baked goods seemed to always linger in the air. When Abigail and Emily first arrived with the baby, they were both hesitant. Abigail stood stiffly in the doorway, clutching the baby's car seat, while Emily hung back, her eyes darting around like she was expecting someone to reprimand her for simply being there. Rachel, sensing their unease, greeted them with a soft smile. "This is your home now," she said gently. "Take your time settling in. There's no rush." She showed them to their rooms, which she'd spent the past week preparing. Abigail's was simple but cozy, with a desk by the window and fresh linens on the bed. Emily's room was a little more playful, with a bookshelf full of children's stories, and a soft quilt that Rachel had found at a local shop. For the baby, Rachel had set up a small nursery in the room next to Abigail's, complete with a crib, changing table, and a few stuffed animals. The girls didn't say much that first day, but the relief on their faces was unmistakable. Adjusting to their new life wasn't easy though. Abigail carried a lot of guilt, and it showed in the way she approached motherhood. She was overly cautious with the baby, double-checking everything Rachel did, and insisting on taking on all the responsibilities herself. "She's my baby," Abigail said one evening when Rachel offered to help with the late-night feeding. I'm supposed to take care of her. And you are, Rachel reassured her. But no one does it alone, Abigail. It's okay to let people help you. Abigail hesitated, but eventually handed Rachel the bottle. It was a small moment, but it was the first sign that she was starting to let go of some of the weight she'd been carrying. Emily, on the other hand, struggled in a different way. For so long, she had been the one holding everything together, keeping Abigail's secret, taking care of the baby, and protecting her sister from their parents. Now that they were safe, she didn't know how to stop. She spent most of her time in the nursery, hovering over the baby or organizing the changing table. Rachel noticed and gently encouraged her to take breaks, to spend time outside, or try some of the activities she used to enjoy. One afternoon, Rachel found Emily sitting on the back porch, staring out at the garden. You don't have to be strong all the time, you know, Rachel said as she sat down beside her. Emily didn't respond right away. She was quiet for so long that Rachel thought she wouldn't say anything at all. But then in a small voice she said, I don't know how to stop. Rachel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do it all by yourself anymore, she said. We're a team now. Over the weeks, the tension in the house began to ease. Abigail started smiling more, especially when the baby cooed or giggled at something she did. Emily, too, seemed to relax, spending less time hovering in the nursery and more time exploring the neighborhood or reading on the porch. Rachel worked hard to build a sense of normalcy for them. She signed Abigail up for online classes so she could work toward her high school diploma while still taking care of the baby. She also got Emily involved in a local art program, giving her an outlet for all the emotions she had been bottling up for so long. The baby, who had been so fragile and feverish when Emily first brought her to the hospital, grew stronger every day. Rachel nicknamed her Sunny because of the way her face lit up whenever someone smiled at her. It was a fitting name, and soon everyone in the house was calling her that. But not everything was smooth sailing. The parents were still a looming presence, even from afar. While they had signed away custody, they occasionally sent passive-aggressive messages to Rachel, accusing her of enabling bad behavior or undermining the family. Rachel ignored most of the messages, but one particularly nasty text from their father hit a nerve. You've taken our daughters away from us, it read. Don't think they'll thank you for it. Rachel didn't respond, but the message lingered in her mind. That night, as she tucked Sunny into her crib, she thought about everything Abigail and Emily had endured, the judgment, the strict rules, the lack of support, and wondered how long it would take for them to truly believe they were safe. One day, about a month after they moved in, Abigail came to Rachel with a question that caught her off guard. Why are you doing all of this? She asked, holding Sunny on her hip. You barely know us. Rachel thought for a moment before answering. Because family is supposed to take care of each other, she said simply. And because I know what it feels like to not have anyone in your corner. I don't want that for you. Abigail looked down at Sunny, her expression thoughtful. It's hard to trust people, she admitted. I know, Rachel said. But you've been through enough. It's time for someone else to take care of you for a change. By the end of the first 2 months, things had started to fall into place. Abigail had settled into a routine with Sunny, growing more confident in her role as a mother. Emily had rediscovered her love of painting, filling the house with colorful drawings and brightening the walls with her artwork. For the first time in a long time, the girls had a sense of stability. But the scars of their past weren't gone. They lingered in the way Abigail sometimes flinched when someone raised their voice, or the way Emily hesitated before asking for something, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to. Rachel knew it would take time, but she also knew they were on the right path. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, Rachel sat on the porch with Abigail and Emily. Sunny was asleep in her crib, and the three of them watched as fireflies blinked in the fading light. You know, Rachel said, breaking the silence, this house feels a lot more alive with you two here. Emily smiled faintly, and Abigail leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than Rachel had ever seen her. Thank you, Abigail said softly. Rachel reached over and squeezed her hand. You don't have to thank me, she said. We're family. And for the first time it felt true. The months that followed were far from perfect, but they were filled with progress. Abigail continued her online classes, and while balancing schoolwork and motherhood was challenging, she was determined to build a future for herself and Sunny. Emily, once so guarded and withdrawn, began to blossom in ways Rachel hadn't expected. She started participating in local art contests, and even made a few friends at the community center, something she hadn't had the freedom to do before. Sunny was the glue that held them all together. Her giggles echoed through the house, her chubby little hands reaching for anything within her grasp. She had a way of bringing light into every moment, and it was impossible not to smile when she was around. Rachel often joked that Sunny was their unofficial peacemaker, her presence softening even the most difficult days. Rachel kept her promise to create a safe, stable environment for the girls, but their past still lingered in small, painful ways. Abigail struggled with guilt, often questioning if she was a good enough mother. Emily, though happier, still had moments where she slipped back into her role as the protector, stepping in whenever she thought Abigail needed help. Rachel reminded them constantly that they didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. She made sure they had counseling sessions, both individually and as a family, to help them process the trauma they'd endured. Slowly, the weight they carried began to lift. The turning point came on a quiet Saturday morning. The three of them were in the kitchen, Rachel making pancakes while Abigail fed Sunny in her high chair, and Emily painted at the table. The scene was so ordinary, so peaceful, that it almost felt surreal. Rachel looked at them, her heart full. For months, she had poured everything she had into giving these girls a second chance. And now, watching them laugh and smile, she finally felt like they believed they deserved it. "Hey," she said, catching their attention. "You know, I'm proud of you both." Abigail blinked, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," Rachel said simply. "For how far you've come. For how hard you're working. For being the amazing people you are." Emily glanced up from her painting, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Abigail, holding Sunny, looked down at her daughter and then back at Rachel. "Thank you," she said softly. It wasn't a grand moment. There were no fireworks, no dramatic gestures. But it was a moment of peace, a quiet affirmation that they were a family now. Maybe not the one they had started with, but the one they had chosen to build together. For Rachel, that was more than enough.